Hi there, and welcome to this session where we'll try to answer the question, why is architecture important? To answer that question, we need to think of a number of different dimensions around that problem, including how do we actually build quality solutions? Well, there are a number of architectural concerns that can be important in building quality solutions, and we'll also look at what happens when there is a lack of focus on those architectural concerns. And we'll see some of the typical issues that can cause problems. And by the end, we will hopefully sum everything up and answer the question, why is architecture important? Now, back in the early 1990s, the International Standards Organization put together a paper on how to build quality software solutions. They talked about different dimensions of quality, which include usability, functionality, efficiency, maintainability, portability, and reliability. And they looked into each of those, and they then later did an update because they found that security and compatibility were also very important dimensions as well. One of the things they mention in all of their guides and updates is that architecture can have a significant effect on how a lot of these different dimensions of quality will actually come out. Things like maintainability, efficiency, the reliability, the compatibility of software are often a direct result of how good the architecture is. So architecture is important in building quality solutions, and we need to think of many of these dimensions ahead of time to make sure that things turn out well. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Quite often, there's a lack of architectural concerns, and we can end up with what we might call a spaghetti architecture. You've definitely heard of spaghetti code. Well, the architecture can sort of end up in the same place, and that might be where each component communicates and becomes dependent on many other components. This can cause the architecture to become less flexible and much more difficult to manage. Sometimes this is referred to as a tightly coupled architecture or a brittle architecture, due to the fact that changing any one of the components often breaks or requires changes to multiple other components. So, what are some of the typical architectural issues that we have to deal with? One of the main causes of architectural issues is poor service abstraction. This occurs when services for the core business concepts aren't correctly isolated or abstracted, or when business rules are actually spread across multiple systems, and we don't have any clear structures that enable reuse. Poor service abstraction can lead to unmanageable dependencies. When system components aren't correctly isolated from each other, updating or replacing a component can have a knock-on effect that requires changes to one or more other components. Sometimes introducing an enterprise service bus, or ESB, to coordinate the communication between different systems can help, but it won't guarantee that the systems are independent if the core business concepts aren't properly normalized. And finally, we may have inflexible and slow-moving legacy systems. There are many reasons it can be difficult to quickly update the legacy system. If the system accumulates a large amount of core information and becomes very complex, then changing that system can take a lot of time. If other systems depend on this core system that the legacy system has become, they can become tightly coupled, requiring both the legacy system and the new system to be changed. Sometimes the legacy system has an underlying technology that has become obsolete, and finding people with the skills to make the changes can be difficult, or it just can be difficult to work on in general. So it can be helpful to be more careful around some of these architectural issues and concerns, especially for legacy systems. So, why is architecture important? Well, if we spend time thinking about and discussing the architecture, this will increase awareness and understanding of the architecture and help drive consensus among all the teams that are involved. It can also help us manage the complexity of the projects, and if we manage it well, it may help reduce the overall risk. By communicating more, thinking about the complexity and the risks, this will help us support planning and do a better job of anticipating and building solutions that will be more well understood as we're going through the process. It can also facilitate change. When something does come up that requires us to veer from the original design or path, an architecture can show us exactly what needs to change and help that communication and planning make sure that everything will be okay. And finally, if we get a lot of these benefits, it can also help us reduce the overall cost of our projects. So spending time thinking about architecture can provide a lot of different benefits, not just technical, but also in how we're going to operate and the overall visibility of how things are going to be built. So we talked about building quality solutions and what can happen when there's a lack of architectural concerns. We looked at some of the typical types of issues and the problems that they cause, and then discussed why architecture is important. So that's it for why is architecture important. Thanks for listening.